Hello, everyone. Today I am with Michael Meade from Michael Meade Mosaic Voices. Michael is a mythologist, storyteller, and author. The Water of Life, Fate and Destiny, The Genius Myth, the three of his books. And Michael, I was reading lately, this is something that you wrote, which I like very much. Amid the radical changes and polarization of modern life, something ancient and knowing keeps trying to catch up with us. I think that's beautiful.
Hopefully it's true. We need help from somewhere. And perhaps like Carl Jung, I'm hoping it's coming from the soul. And as a matter of fact, from the soul of the world. So I think that the modern world is moving too fast and is moving fast without knowing where it's going. And so one of the things I like to say lately is we're in the middle of a collective rite of passage. And the middle of a collective rite of passage is the liminal phase or stage between one thing and another. And when you're in the liminal, the idea is to stop, open the windows of the soul, open the eyes of the heart, and sit, and listen to what's going on, because the other world is sending messages in the form of dreams, visions, insights all the time. And what we need when we get so polarized and so off, what would you call it? Off any meaningful path, is we need those messages and those visions that are insightful as well as visionary. And so we have to learn how to live and grow in the liminal.
Well, Michael, let's get back to that soon, if we can. Because firstly, I just wondered whether we could maybe start. Can you just tell us a little bit about, like I've read where I think it was your auntie when you were 13 gave you a copy of Edith Hamilton's Mythology, which seemed to be a good little gift at the time.
By mistake, she gave it to me.
She thought it was a book on history, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, she had asked me, I grew up rather poor, and so I learned not to ask for what I wanted. Because I noticed that not only did I not get it, but my parents seemed depressed for a while about not being able to give it to me. So when my mother asked me what I wanted for my 13th birthday, I said, oh, nothing, it doesn't matter. But my aunt, she asked me what I was interested in. And at that time, I was interested in history. And in a sense, the 13-year-old version of me was trying to figure out what the hell happened around here. Why is everyone in this neighborhood living as if they'd lost their dreams? That's how it seemed to me. And so my aunt set off to get me a history book. And she was a notoriously short person. So I imagine when she went into the store and said, where do I get a history book? And they pointed to a top shelf. She went over.
Pulled from the mythology section.
She took out the mythology book and it was wrapped up, and then she gave it to me. And I love getting a book. And so I tore the paper open and I saw this flying horse and a guy on the horse shooting an arrow. I want this book. And my aunt said, oh, it's the wrong book. I got the wrong book. And I said, no, it's the right book. And so it was the right, wrong book. It was a gift given by mistake, and yet it was accurate.
Yeah.
And I read this entire book, almost the entire book, that night. And it just opened a different world. And I didn't need to have a better education. I didn't need to be older. I didn't need to be bigger. I didn't need to be less poor. I was welcome in that world, boom, right away. And the world was bigger than the world that I was seeing.
Because you were in a rough part of town, weren't you? Like it was rough and tough.
Yeah. And the myths are rough and tough too. There's a lot going on, there's beasts and the ships are getting lost, and the sisters of fate are giving everybody, limitations and all this. And to me, it was just a beautiful expansion of the world. And so I didn't realize it at the time, and there was no one there to confirm it in me, but I had found my field, my world, and my path. And then unfortunately, just as is the case for most young people in the modern world, there's no rite of passage. There's no necessary engaged mentoring going on. So when I was telling people, including my aunt, how great this was, they just didn't even hear me. And of course, in school, they didn't want to talk about mythology. And so then I thought it was a hobby. I kept my interest in it. I kept reading about it, but I didn't know that it was actually a life path.
And you went off to Vietnam too, didn't you?
Well, I didn't go. I was
Ah,
so I got drafted and
ah,
refused to go. And it's a pretty complicated story, but when I got the draft notice,
mm,
I wrote back and I said, you know, it's not a declared war. Near as I can tell, it's not a just war. So I'm not coming. But if you have another war, let me know. And I thought I was being open-minded and courteous. Well, soon came a knock on the door saying, you either go into the military or you go to jail. And so at that point, and this is interesting because I didn't have the power of my own convictions. My father had been in World War II. All my aunts and uncles had been part of World War II. They all thought I had to go. My entire neighborhood thought I had to go. My friends thought I had to go. When I asked my mother, she said, our sons always go.
mm.
And so I just couldn't withstand all of that. So I went. But then in the military, what happened is they started to give me orders that I didn't feel were appropriate. And so my way of being was to say, well, I'm not going to do that. Just, you know, I could do that order. Give me another order. And so then I got in trouble. And so then I got
That
court-martialed.
doesn't always go over so well in the military. That
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
asking for options.
Yeah. So eventually I got a serious court-martial and was put into a military prison. And what do they do in a military prison? They give you more orders. You know, and I said, didn't you get the memo? I'm here because I'm not doing orders. So then they threw me in solitary confinement. And so I was in there for months,
Which
actually.
is a bit of a rite of passage in itself, I'd
It was
imagine.
a underworld rite of passage. I was in the underworld.
Mm,
And in the process of being in there, when I thought they weren't taking me seriously,
mm,
because they kept thinking I was going to give this up, and they kept sending colonels in. The general came in to talk to me. They were all going to convince me, and I was going to give it up. Well, I wasn't giving it up. So in order to convince them that I really wasn't part of what they were doing, I stopped eating. And so that went on for months, actually, the solitary confinement and the not eating also. And so I had gone in at maybe 150 pounds. And by the time I got out, I was 87 pounds. I had really almost disappeared. But it became an underworld rite of passage. And in the depths of the darkness of the solitary nature of that cell, what came back to me was myth. And Odysseus and all kinds of characters from myth were showing up and kind of hanging out with me and giving me advice. And so I got to the point where I had to figure out, am I losing my mind or am I finding my mind?
mm.
And I decided it was healthier to think I was finding my mind. And so the whole mythology thing came back as much more than an interest or a hobby. It came back as a life-saving thing.
So
And so
how did you start to find that, how to put that into the world? Or how did that come about?
how did I what?
As you went through that rite of passage and you
Yeah.
realized the essential nature of myth, but then when that kind of experience finished, how did you start to teach about this, or how did it come into the world, and
What
how
was an
did that
interesting
happen?
that happened? You know, if you think of a rite of passage, there's three phases: the separation,
Yeah,
the ordeals phase or the liminal phase, the betwixt and between, in which the change of life occurs and the awakening occurs. And then there's the return, typically to be welcomed by a knowing community.
yeah.
Well, my return was rejection by everybody.
Mm,
For you know, so I was really lost now. I was not in solitary, but I was in solitary.
mm,
So I started to remember things about stories, and I started to research stuff in mythology about underworld and about coming back. And that led me into studying anthropology and figuring out rites of passage, literally rites of passage stuff. And that led me to studying the old Irish practice of fasting against injustice. And I started to compile these ideas. And then I realized I had to make my own return somehow, and that no one was going to be there welcoming me. It didn't happen. And so I had to find my own way to be welcome in the world, in a sense. And then what's really interesting is a number of years later, when I had the opportunity to imagine how I could help or be helpful to other people,
Bring something
I
back.
started working with street kids. I started working with gang members and street kids. I worked with battle veterans. I worked with war resistors. I worked with refugees, because what I had found was a connection to the people who are not welcome in the world, to the people who are lost, who are struggling, who are rejected or turned into the other. And so then I started an organization to work with people in those situations by using story and myth, and by getting people to tell the most the deepest parts of their own story and figure out how that connects to myth, to see that they're actually in a bigger story than they think they are in, because that's what happened to me. I realized I was in a bigger story. I was just one person caught up in a war and then thrown into the underworld. But the bigger story was understanding that you could have an underworld rite of passage, and understanding that to be a grown person, you had to have a rite of passage of some kind, at least on a psychological level. And so then that eventually became, somehow that led me to telling stories. And so I became a storyteller, and then writing about it, and that makes you kind of a mythologist, and then it just kept going.
There's the difference between you and other people, maybe, in the variety of people involved in, Jung and Hillman and all. Storytellers are a rare breed, aren't they? There's not so many around in a way. Like it's a, it's almost like, out of all the callings, like storytelling is a particular little calling, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and
Well,
then I
when I
found,
say little calling, I don't mean that. I mean a
yeah,
peculiar calling.
well, then I kind of complicated it, because so one thing I had learned, I began to learn it in that solitary cell, was if I'm going to die, I'm going to die in connection to what's meaningful to me. That's, to die on the battlefield in a war that I didn't think was just, that seemed like an abandonment of my own soul. And a greater abandonment would be to kill in circumstances that I thought were unjust. That's why I realized I had to fast my way out of this. But what I then found is that by having nothing in my life, I'm basically skin and bone in a cell by myself 24 hours a day. Well, I found some things that I loved. I found some things that I wanted to live for. I had figured out what I was willing to die for. And then I started to figure out what I wanted to live for. And then it took a while, but eventually I realized that stories are totally compelling to me. They're like X-ray machines. From inside a story, I can see things I could never see otherwise. And I can even help people get into a story, and then they see things differently. And so in the meantime, I had an interest in ethnic storytelling. Is very ethnic, and I'd studied stories from all over the world, just on my own. But then I started listening to stories from music from different cultures while I was studying stories. So now I was mixing stories and music, which actually is an old thing, but I didn't know that. So then I got interested in rhythm, and I started playing hand drums. And then I accidentally started working on a rhythm that I was interested in while I was thinking about a story. And what happened is I could see the story. It was like I was in the story. And it totally changed the way I was perceiving stories. And I'd never told a story out of, I've never rehearsed, ever. I've been telling stories for 45 years or more, but I've never rehearsed a story. I just tell it like from inside out.
Yeah.
And so now I was performing, telling stories while playing African drums. And that opened all kinds of things, because it turns out most people can't resist that. The rhythm drives images into people. Young people can't resist it at all. And most people, and so I could be in any kind of cultural situation or anything. And if you play, there's certain kind of rhythms that are like, they call it light trance. And it's kind of like the video screen actually has a little pattern, and it's a pattern that's compelling. Uh, Drum can be even more compelling. And so telling a story while playing a compelling rhythm turns out to be change all the energy in a room. And most people.
And by the way, turns out to be what they actually did in Indigenous tribes.
I was rediscovering the old thing,
Yeah.
or connected to what you said at the beginning, something old caught up to me. And I was now being in Ireland, it's called a shanachie. In Africa, it's called a griot. In other places, it's called a shaman. It's all related to rhythm and voice and mythic image. And so that became a thing that I do until this day. But then someone asked me to write about it. And so the next thing I was writing books about it also. So then I wound up through story.
The water of
being
life.
Yes, being in both the literary world and the oral tradition world. And I've been in both of them for over 40 years now. And sometimes I can't tell which one I'm supposed to be doing. But both of them have been meaningful to me. And so in a funny way, if you track it back to that 13th birthday, that was the beginning of an arc of awakening that continues to this day, that has at its center imagination, mythic imagination, story, and specifically stories that move the soul. That's been the arc.
And Michael, you write about fate and destiny. I think, more than, that's an area you've written on a lot. And I wonder whether you could tell us a bit about that.
Well, and that goes back to a number of things, like trying to figure out, when I was really young, what's wrong here? Why are my parents so unhappy? Why is this whole neighborhood so conflicted? And then when I got out of solitary confinement, I had to understand it. And one of the few ways to understand it was fate. And on my 13th birthday, when I opened that book early in Edith Hamilton's book on myth, it's just simply called Mythology, is the story of the three sisters of fate who give you the thread of your life, and which becomes your fate. And so I had to absorb that. And so then I was, I forget what year it was and all that kind of thing. As a mythologist, I can't do dates, but I can do stories.
You can do aeons or something like that.
Yeah, and timeless things make sense to me. But anyway, I had been considering fate and then thinking about destiny as the opposite of fate. And then a very Jungian thing happened, synchronicity, you could call it, is I was at this conference, and I was happy to be at that conference because I wanted to meet James Hillman, who maybe then, but certainly shortly after, was the only living direct student of Carl Jung. So I wanted to meet him, and he was giving a talk at this conference, and I went to the talk. And it was a very explosive talk, and the room got divided into the people that liked it and the people, typical Hillman kind of thing. And then this conference,
which is what I love about him, by the way.
Well, yeah,
the fire of
exactly, right. So I go outside after the conference, got very intense in there, and I see Dr. Hillman standing on this little deck over the lake. So I thought, well, I'm going to go and introduce myself, He looks like he's in the kind of contemplative mood, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I come up, and then he looks at me, and I think, okay, there's my opening. And I say, here's my name. I was just at your lecture. And he goes, well, what did you think? And I said, well, the room got really divided into pro and con. And he said, why? And I said, well, I think it was partly your speech and your title, because I think your title was Jesus Christ and the Atomic Bomb, Two Children of the Modern Age. I think you split the room.
Could have something to do with that.
Like splitting the atom. And he goes, oh, I think you're right. He said, so what are you interested in? Almost like my aunt saying, what are you interested in when I was 13? And I said, well, right now I'm thinking about fate and destiny. He goes, what are you thinking about then? I said, well, how fate limits and destiny pulls you beyond the limits. He said, that's a damn good thought. And I just felt I got blessed. It was like having someone bless my intelligence, actually. And he said, keep thinking about that. So then I wrote a book about it. And so to me, it's one of the few ways of putting into one storyline the fact that each person is limited and restricted by circumstances of birth, by DNA, as they call it nowadays, by historical influences, by local neighborhood influences, and so on. And yet each person is secretly tied to a star and aimed at a destination that is meaningful and transcendent in its essence. And so
this is a bit of an excursion, Michael, but whilst you were saying all that, I was thinking of the time of COVID. I think many people had the experience of the limitations
yes.
and the sensory deprivation, the entertainment deprivation, etc. I'm speaking myself included.
Yeah.
It's what you're talking about, how it opens up, which is. It's kind of, what is it? It's remedial training for Western culture too, because we kind of think, the straight upward path, success, everything should be expansive, open, good, da-da-da.
Yeah.
But it's the opposite side of the coin, that the limitation actually brings the open.
Yeah. Well, during COVID, one thing I was writing about and talking about was that we're all going down. We're all descending. We're falling out of mutual community. Many of us are restricted in our homes or wherever we are. Why not make it a conscious descent? And that was the old idea in the Greek myths, the difference between falling into the underworld and choosing to descend. Katabasis, the conscious descent into the depths of the soul in order to reclaim something that was missing in the outer world or in the conscious world of the individual, or both. And so I started writing and talking about the isolation and the social distancing, as it was being called, as the opportunity to consciously descend and find what's missing in our lives. And that's how I saw it, which is, I got that directly from Greek myths. But it's true in other myths too. In the process of rites of passage or initiation, a young person would be put into a dark hut and denied food and stuff, so that they would go into this kind of descent. In parts of Africa, a young person going through an initiation is buried up to their neck in the earth, as if they actually descend into the realm of the dead in order to be reborn. And so
there's the ordeal, aspect of it, isn't there? Always.
But central to it is an experience of death, which, if we put it into Jungian terms or depth psychology terms, is the death of the ego. So that the way a person grows is their ego dies so that they can be reborn with a greater, more conscious self. And so all the things that, the modern world, like you were referring to it, is avoids death. And people basically don't want to think about death. And yet, other than life, it's the only thing we all experience together. And so the old saying was, die before you die, which means die the little deaths in order to have a greater life. And so I was just drawing from the myths, and I was drawing from that isolation in prison and saying that we go down, we let go, we lose everything in order to find a deeper thing, and we come back with a bigger sense of our own life and something more to give to life. And so I saw COVID as a collective rite of passage, and I think we're still in that. That the world that we thought we had, the world that we used to have, is gone. It's already gone. It's not that it's disappearing, it's gone. And so we're in that liminal space, and we haven't seen the next world view. The Western worldview is not sustainable. It's proven. It's causing climate crisis, it's causing human crisis, and it's at its end of its arc. Jung called it
it's death and rebirth. Sorry,
but on a collective level,
Mm.
And Jung referred to it as the shifting of the archetypes.
Mm.
Modern people talk about a paradigm shift, but a
Mm.
paradigm shift is simply something new added on to what's going on. An archetypal shift, or a shift of the archetypes, is a return back to the origins in order to draw a new vision and new energy for another worldview. That's what we're in, I think.
It
We need.
raises an interesting point with me, and I know Hillman definitely spoke about this. So I don't know about Bly and yourself, but it's the youth and the older person, you know, because it's a strange mix, isn't it? You need the freshness of youth and all of that. And then sometimes, but it's like, well, you know, definitely when I was a youth, I wasn't thinking of the old that was trying to catch up to me. The 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 really ancestral or the primordial or something like that. So there's something about how the old and the new have to work together, but it's not the simplest of things. And when we
Well,
look
there's
around,
levels. So
right?
you could say, if you agree that we're at the end of an era,
Yeah,
the dominant Western world view is collapsing, it's not working. In Russia, they think it's World War II again. You know, people are not caught in the same world view. So that's the end of an era, you could say.
yeah,
So that makes everybody older. And even the young people are older. They're not having those great visions, which Jung would call the puer visions.
right.
They're not having it. They're actually trapped in technology and things that are not transcendent. So then what happens? Well, on a psychological level, the way I understand it, everybody has inside, and I'm using now Jung's terminology and Hillman's terminology, the puer and the senex,
Yeah,
the eternal youth and the wise old man or wise old woman.
yeah,
And at the end of an era, the trick is to bring the eternal young together with the wise old self. That's the trick, because when those two are interconnected, you get a new vision that is actually an old vision being renewed.
yeah.
So that was one, Jung wrote about that.
Mm,
Um, and so, but it's also interesting because I found a tribe in Africa
mm,
who says that when we're initiating young people, we're awakening the elder in them. And when we're initiating elders, we're reviving the eternal youth in them. I found
ah,
a tribe that
that's
they
great.
understood rite of passage that way.
Mm,
So from that point of view, and this is true, this would be true in Ireland as much as in Africa. That is to say, when a young person is being initiated, something old and wise in them is being awakened. The dream they have of life, which is part of the younger visionary part,
mm,
is being made conscious, but something that was deeply unconscious, the wise, old sage in their heart, is also being awakened. And so to be at the end of an era, we have to have the eternal youth and the wise old sage together.
mm,
um, that's a way to survive the end and the beginning.
mm.
Those two, on an internal level, are like the dream and the wisdom inside a person. On an external level, they're the end and the beginning. And so, and Jung wrote a lot about that. He
Mm.
wrote a lot about the eternal youth, the puer, and the senex. And then James Hillman picked that up and wrote that great book called Puer, or Puer Papers, and where he writes about that way before the period that we're in now. I mean, 30, 40 years before it. Uh, but I think they were both right about it. We're in the collapse renewal,
Mm.
because that's the other way to talk about it. Jung, at the beginning of World War II, was writing about apocalypse, amongst other things. And he went back to the original meaning of apocalypse, the Greek word, which means, it has several meanings. One is the lifting of the veil. And so when you see World War II beginning, there's a lifting of the veil, and you see evil, if you want to call it that. And you see people building machines of death and so on. But the other meaning of apocalypse is collapse renewal, collapse renewal. And so we are, and that's another understanding of the liminal. We're in
And,
the descent awakening.
and it seems to me that sometimes, like someone could get stuck in the death aspect of it. I mean, you know, there's various ways to look at it, but it
Yeah.
seems that to be able to see the renewal aspect of it too is well,
Yeah.
to me, seems like a very important thing. I mean, it's
Yeah.
hard to know what form the renewals take, but even within our own
So
soul, we need the newness. We need the
we
new
renew our
beginning.
lives all the time. You
Mm,
know, I'll be with an audience and, you know, how many people have had their life unravel? And almost every hand goes up, and some people are waving two hands, like it's happened to me 5 times. And yet here they are. And so I wrote a book called Why the World Doesn't End, and where I just took stories of collapse and renewal from different cultures
mm,
just to show how it goes.
mm.
And there's one really great Native American story where it's the old woman who weaves the world. She's in this cave and she's the one weaving the world. But she has this black dog. And she not only weaves the world, she has to go and stir the stew of all the seeds of all the plants and all the flowers and all the vegetables and all the forests, or else they'll burn. And while she's stirring the stew, the dog takes a loose thread on this beautiful garment, which is the world, and it unravels the whole garment. And then she comes back, and all the work she had done to weave all the elements of beauty are gone. And then she sits down. The story doesn't say whether she's feeling despair or deep grief or what. You have to fill it in as a human. And then she sees the loose thread and she picks it up. And as soon as she picks it up, she has a new vision of the world, a better vision, it says in the story. And she begins to weave the world again. So then I use that to say to everybody, we're there with the old woman. We're watching the unraveling of the world, and we're invited to pick up a thread. And whatever thread we pick up is going to help release the vision that we can bring to the weaving of the next world. So there's a way to use
Which is what
mythology.
happened. Which is what happened to you when you were in solitary confinement or whatever as well. So it's kind of like,
More or less, I found that thread of story.
mm,
And so then you have an Irish myth because, you know, archetypally, many of the myths meet and interact and interweave. So
mm,
there's a famous old Irish myth that says when the center falls apart, the current name for the center falling apart is we're all polarized.
mm,
Well, the reason people are polarized is because there's no soul at the center holding us together. It's loss of soul.
mm.
But in the Irish myth, they say when the center falls apart, each person is to go into the forest in the place that looks the darkest to them. That sounds very Jungian. Go into the dark,
Yeah.
um, and there you will find a thread. And when you find that thread, you pull it back to the center. And when enough people pull the threads back, you reweave the center. And it's the same story as the Native American story. It's the same story as the Greek idea of collapse and renewal. So that mythology has that archetypal understanding that the world ends and it begins frequently, just the way a forest ends and the trees fall down and decompose, and from that decomposed tree material, the next forest grows. And all the ancient people knew if you wanted to understand the mystery of life, you read the text of nature. And so the ecology movement, which is a really important thing, needs more mythology in order to understand how to get people into ecology.
Mm.
That's just a thought.
It's kind of like there needs to be, well, in my language, the anima mundi is where there's actually the love of the world as well, is also what brings more of an ecology towards the world. It's not just the regulatory thing. You know, a lot of these things are not just regulatory, they're openings within the soul, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. Well, the tree of life was probably the one symbol that appears in almost all cultures, all religions, and most philosophies. And the tree of life is really the the axle connecting the cosmos to the earth and the heavens to the earth and all. And it's actually the source of all thoughts and all fields of thinking, and all religions are all connected back to the tree of life. And that's another understanding that we have to get back in touch with the tree of life, which was the central connecting kind of axis of the axis mundi. And so and the tree of life appears like in the Bible, it's there. It's in the center of the Garden of Eden, But the Christians get really intrigued with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is not at the center. It's distant from the center.
Right.
And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the tree of the knowledge of polarization and opposites. And the tree of life is the tree of union, bringing those opposites together. And people don't even know there's another tree. That was the aim, was to get to the tree of life. So I call the tree of the knowledge of good and evil a starter tree. It's
Right.
like get you into getting intrigued, but the aim is to get to the place of union, which of course Jung was all about that. The
Yeah.
self being the archetype of union.
The conjunction. And I want to get on to the genius myth, because that seems to me another incredibly important idea that, well, you tell what the Greeks called the daemon and the Romans called the genius. Can you tell us, and why do you write about that?
Well, what happened with that was interesting. So a lot of things come to me through actual experience.
Right.
So I was working with gangs. I was working with kids running the streets and gangs, because I knew the rough neighborhood kind of thing and I could relate to them. And it's becoming a bigger and bigger thing still in the United States. And kids get lost in the street life and the gang life. And so I'm working with these gangs, like at the time in Chicago, South Side of Chicago. And this one gang I was working with, they loved stories and they kept wanting me to come back and tell them stories. And I'd go back and sometimes, you know, guns are getting pulled out and bullets are flying, but we just duck and then go back to the story. That's how it was. And but when I would go back, like having been away for 2 months, they say, you know, so and so, yeah, well, he's dead. You know, so and so. And so these 16 and 17-year-old kids were dying during the time that I was coming to visit regularly. And it really was breaking my heart. And I didn't understand that it was like devastated my sense of being. I mean, how can a culture erode to the point where kids are shooting each other in the streets and no one is actually trying to stop it? And so I then thought, what can I do? How can I help? Because those kids that I'm seeing on one visit, some of them won't be there the next time. How do you talk to a young person who you may be the only person talking to them in a meaningful way, and you may be the last person talking to them about their soul? And try to figure out how would you do that. And I fell on the idea of genius because it's a common word in the Western world, and people have some idea that it means someone really smart or someone really talented. That's not the meaning of it, but that's what people think.
Yeah.
So I tried using that with kids. I mean, tattooed, armed gang kids, saying, you know, you have genius. What do you mean? What do you mean? And I said, well, you have a part of you that is like a genius part, like you have a talent or a gift of some kind because you were born that way. And even if no one has seen it, you have it. And literally, they all would want to know more. They want explain that, because that's not history. They've been told what their history is. It's not sociology. It's not even psychology. It's like almost mythology.
Yeah.
And they loved it. So I realized I was onto something. And then, of course, I knew that genius was a Roman word. Genius, by the way, means the spirit that's already there. That's the literal meaning of it, the spirit that's already there. So that means the spirit that's there when you're born. And then the daimon is the Greek word, which is a similar thing, except that it goes more into the idea of a spirit companion. And it opens up the daimonic world as a whole separate world. So I realized that this is a really important archetype. And in my experience in the United States, as long as I've been alive, the only story, mythic story that has become somewhat known on a popular level is the hero's myth or the hero's journey. And I like the hero's myth. I studied Hero with a Thousand Faces when I was trying to recover from solitary confinement. And I got a lot out of that book. But one thing that's said right in the beginning of the book, I never accepted. That is to say that the hero myth is the monomyth. It's the one story. Well, from the time I was 13 on, I knew that myth was a multiple thing,
Right.
that you have to have many stories. And I also knew by instinct that creation stories are not hero stories.
Right.
Trickster stories tend to be not hero stories either. And there's
Yeah.
a whole categories of story that don't fit. So the hero story is not a monomyth. It's just a myth being treated as a monomyth. So then, and then I thought about it and I thought, hero tends to be masculine in tone. It tends to be aimed at the external world. It's easily converted into muscles and power and dominance, which is what Hollywood has done with it.
Yeah.
And genius is the spirit that's there when you're born. And
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if you're a girl or a boy, or if you're going to be a trans person. It doesn't matter if you come from a poor family or you're born into wealth. It's the spirit that's born with you. And I realize it's a more general kind of a mythic propensity, and it involves everybody. And so then I wrote a book called The Genius Myth, trying to say that when the world gets so complex and so conflicted, and so dominated by certain elements, we don't need more heroes exactly. We need something that everybody can find in themselves, not out in the world. And so that was a book trying to say that everyone has some genius. The genius is there from the beginning. It's part of their soul. It includes gifts and qualities they have that are intended to be given to the world. And that awakening to one's genius means also hearing the call of one's life. And when the world is falling apart, you don't need a career, you need a calling. And so that was the idea behind that book.
And what I like about it is that, so maybe sometimes in psychology, there is that, if you read Thomas More or whatever, that there's that accent in fixing some problem, eradicating something, getting rid of what's wrong, all of that, right? There can be. Whereas this kind of shifts it over to finding more of what's right, finding more of the intrinsic rightness of what were you born with, which is so, yeah, I mean, we don't like to use words like motivational or inspirational in the old sense, in the old heroic sense, but it is inspirational.
Well, and I was working with boys and girls and college students, young guys and young women, and they all got it. Genius work for everybody.
Mm.
And so in the book, part of what I write about is kind of like the Irish myth when everything's falling apart. Instead of saying you have to find a thread, you have to find your genius. And that the world gets remade through the awakening of genius in a number of people. In other words, there's no single idea or single religious principle or single invention that's going to bring everybody together. That won't happen. The evidence is already clear. That's not what it is. But if everyone had a greater sense of self and genius and aim or purpose in the world, then some people would be drawn to work on new kinds of medicine and healing. Other people would be drawn to work on making the rivers in nature more cleaning the rivers. And other people would be working on making peace. And other people would be working on helping people die. And all of a sudden, there'd
It's
be more genius in all the areas of life.
it's just
And we,
different in everyone, which is one of those strange things.
yeah.
It can't be the same in two people exactly.
Yeah. And so that's the other thing that I found really important to say to young people, and it turns out to be true for everybody, that each person is unique, that each person's soul is unique. Um, if a person doesn't live their life in a meaningful way, no one will ever live it. People will live other things, but no one will live that experiment, that meaning, that revelation of that unique self. And that really resonates with people too. It's not that you're special. That's hierarchical thinking. It's you're unique.
Yeah.
And of course, Jung had that idea, the unique soul. And it's interesting when you think about mysticism and transcendence. The deep idea of the mystics is that it's the uniqueness of the soul that connects to the universal. That a person doesn't connect to the universal by shedding who they are, but by becoming who they are. And so I found that was helpful talking with more educated people too, and psychological people, that we're here to live a unique life. And I think what Jung did, which really helped people get out of some of the traps of Freudian thinking, Jung went to Eastern mythology and found the golden flower. And that led to talking about the golden self and all that kind of thing. And then he brought that back. And whereas
Secret of
Freud
the
thought,
golden flower is the same as what you're saying in a way.
yes, yes. And I read his introduction and so on. and understood that he was talking about Chinese myth, and turning it into psychological language, which I thought was a great service to the Western thinking. But so his idea was really taking myth and turning it into depth psychology, and imagining how people could live it out. And so, and what I learned from working with young people in trouble is when they're in trouble, they're closer to waking up. The hardest thing is to wake up is the kids in school, because they're inside a system that doesn't know they're each unique, that thinks they're citizens or potential career members or potential workers, doesn't realize that what a rite of passage would do would be awaken a person to their own uniqueness. And when we want to grow, we're growing the uniqueness, not the general attributes. The soul doesn't grow in methodical, predictable ways. It grows in the unique way of that soul. And the uniqueness of that soul is what's connected to the soul of the world, the anima mundi. And so that comes to the old idea that I'm sure I got it from Jung, but you could find it in a lot of places, which is change the individual soul, you change the world.
Yeah. I think
You don't change.
I don't know. Look, some of these things remain mysteries, don't they? But there's a lot about. There's these two strains of thought, of social activism and one has to make political change in the world, which is very strong, especially in the US, I might say, social justice change. And then there's this it seems to me there's this kind of mystic Rain Man side of Jung, whereas if you actually transform, then actually, it's like the Zen, what is it? The Zen monk who goes into the market, but things blossom around kind of thing. And it seems to me that both are kind of true, but this one of the mystic idea has been a little bit devalued perhaps right at this moment.
Well, Jung had that idea that the transcendental dynamic was part of the deep self. And so, so another way I talk about it now, that we're in bodhisattva time. So then borrowing from India, the bodhisattva is the enlightened one. And many of the stories about the bodhisattva, sattva means bright intelligence. And so the bodhisattvas in many traditions would kind of like Christian martyrs or something, they would leave the world. They would go to the other world. But the bodhisattva becomes enlightened and realize, oh, there's lots of people in the world suffering, and there's even animals suffering. So I'm not leaving. I'm going to take what I know and I'm going to go back and help the world. And so that's the same idea as the genius, only it's coming from a Indian culture, spiritual tradition. And so I think we're in the bodhisattva time, that we have to be activists, but not necessarily political embattled activists. Some people are best being activists with plant medicines, or activists with healing people, and finding new ways of healing. And so we need to be helping the world, but the most effective way to help the world is to live out one's genius, live out one's inner giftedness, because you'll bring genius quality to the areas where you are instinctively essentially qualified. You may have to learn stuff, but you're qualified from essence. And so in terms of the stories, that's the ones I like, where we're active.
I think another way of saying that is people contribute to the revolution, but they contribute in their own particular ways. Like there's not one way to contribute to the revolution.
Well, no, because the revolution based on one person, one idea, 12 years later turns into its opposite in politics. You can see that anywhere around the world. But I don't think it's revolution we're looking for. And it's certainly not evolution we're looking for. Evolution takes too long. Revolution usually goes awry. It's really an awakening of the soul. I mean, I think Jung was on it. It's an awakening of the individual soul. And when a person begins to act from the deep self, the way Jung put it was they help the neighbors as well as themselves. In other words, you start to have a beneficial effect on other people. And then if you connect that to the arc of one's own life being the arc of a destiny, a destination for that life. And if a person can get engaged with that arc, Jung called it the gradient, but you can call it the arc of transformation. And the old idea was that the soul is here to transform. The essential move of the soul is transformation, to not wind up at the end to be the same person you were at the beginning, but at the end you wind up being the deep self revealed. And so I think that's the only way out of this. I don't think there's going to be a meaningful revolution. I don't think there's going to be time for an evolution. Besides, I think evolution happens alongside devolution. That's what we're seeing in culture now, evolution and devolution. But the soul's path is different than that. And so I think it causes people to be activists engaged with the soul of the world.
Yeah.
I think that can happen.
And this is something that I read, that this is something you wrote, which I saw a couple of days ago. When the soul grows, the ego dies. And I think, I don't know, what is it about psychology? Psychology can get very technical sometimes, go into the ins and outs of narcissism for a couple of hours or whatever. But I like this idea that when the soul grows, because that also gives that something large, that, the thing to aim for, the go towards kind of thing, that the ego dies in the process. It's a beautiful.
Well, I like words. To me, words are stories. A word is a story. So psychology is the logos of psyche, the logic of psyche, and psyche is a Greek word that means butterfly. So psychology is the logic of transformation, because a butterfly is the universal symbol of transformation from the caterpillar to the butterfly. And when it's interesting, I studied the biology of butterflies. And so a fascinating thing happens when the biologists are studying the awakening of the cells. The caterpillar has its own cells, and then it has these dormant cells, latent cells, and they had to give them a name. And so they named them imaginal cells. I don't know if they knew what they were doing.
These things happen.
But talk about psychology. And so the story of the butterfly is the transformation from the lowly caterpillar to the flying, soaring, beautiful butterfly in the Garden of Eden kind of thing, or in the living garden. But it comes from cells that were inside the caterpillar that were dormant. And that's the same idea as the latent genius, or the latent deep self in a person. And so biology and psychology kind of meet in the story of the butterfly in particular. And so it's interesting that psyche means butterfly. And that's part of its mystery. But the mystery of the butterfly is literally transformation, moving from the form of the caterpillar, which is blind and just eating its way through everything like materialism, turning into something that flies and brings beauty to the world and has a lightness, but that would connect it to angels or something like that. So I think of psychology has its own inner story that is about transformation. And I agree with you. Often it gets bogged down. And the details of psychology are fascinating. People who can break down how it happens and all. But psyche as its own story, psyche as soul, psyche as the transformative energy of life, to me is still a bigger, more interesting, and more necessary story. But there are some people whose genius is to break that stuff down.
Yeah.
And if they can figure out how to apply that, they're very meaningful to everybody.
Yes.
The other thing I found, James Hillman and I did a series called The Bridge from Psychology to Myth. And because I wanted to suggest this old idea where there's three layers to the world: the literal world, the world of, well, it used to be called the world of fact, but the world of measurement. That's a singular world because you're supposed to agree on one measurement. But then you double the world when you get to psychology. You have everything is doubled. Me and myself, me and my shadow, me and you. and the world is doubling, and the language of psychology doubles. You have passive aggressive, you have whatever. Anyway, bipolar. You get a doubling of language, and then, but that's not the whole world. The doubling world, the psyche world, turns into the mythic world, which is deeper and bigger. And now you're in the world of threes. The third time is a charm. The three gods in Ireland. Ireland means the three feminine goddesses. That's what Ireland represents as a word. In India, you have Vishnu and Brahma and Shiva, who tears it all apart after they create it, and so on. So mythology is the world of three: me, my soul, and the soul of the world. Everything multiplies again. It's the biggest realm in that sense.
Yeah.
And so psyche, the psychological world, is an amplification and an enlargement of the literal world, but it is also a bridge to the much bigger world, which the mythological world, and the spiritual world is part of that. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, that's good, Michael. There's so much in there. And I'm sure other people have asked this, but because we're close to our hour or so, but can you tell us, well, can I ask, just tell us a little bit about something of Bly and Hillman, your personal perceptions, and what you've learned from them, what comes to mind?
Well, we used to refer to ourselves as the three Amigos, which there was a very funny film years ago about the three Amigos. So what was interesting about it, they were both born in the same year.
Right.
And they were both, I think, 17 years older than me.
Yeah.
And so the classic definition of a mentor is someone a generation older than the younger person. So that they were both of the age to be mentors to me, and they both were mentors to me, and they were opposites. And so Robert was a genius of language and poetry and leaping imagination. I mean, he had his poetry leaps all over the place. He had this leaping quality, but he was also kind of like a poetic Viking. He came from the Viking heritage, and he had that quality, and he would like tear into a new place where no one had gone. And he was a genius. He really had a lot of knowledge, and often I think was used to being the smartest person in the room. James Hillman, more of an introvert, and had been sickly when he was young and had to go and be quiet in the Alps in order to recover and from consumption. His life almost consumed itself, and he was very aware of that and a little bit more careful. But he had this penetrating quality also. He was always turning the rock over. That was his explanation for his own behavior, to see what was underneath the rock.
Couldn't help it.
Yeah. And so they knew each other, but never worked together. And I find myself getting to meet both of them, but also, to be honest, working with Robert was very challenging. He was a big, forceful, easily dominant person that had all this genius and a beautiful language and a great intrigue with emotions, but a little bit hard to work with. And so I asked if he would invite Hillman, who he knew before I did, to come and join us. And surprisingly, Hillman said yes. And that was really helpful to me, because now there were three of us. And Hillman was not someone you could tell what to do or how to think. Neither was Robert, but they both respected each other. And so since this is about the Jung world, the issue I needed help with was the puer. So Robert was very enamored of Marie-Louise von Franz's book on the puer, which has a kind of a German orientation.
A bit like the puer should just grow up and get rid of some of that, boyish stuff.
Exactly that. And so Robert was telling young guys simply that they had to get a job. And I was saying, no, that's not how that works. That puer is the spirit of their life. It has to be engaged. It can't be squashed or put to work. Hillman wrote puer papers, which is really a kind of an adoration of the puer. And the idea, Hillman had this great idea, which you can only ground the puer in its own territory. So that was different. That's a psychological territory, a mythological territory, not work, not a literal fundamentalist approach to grounding the spirit of young people. So when Hillman agreed to join us, I introduced the topic of the puer and had each of them talk about the puer. And I thought this could be fireworks. This could be the end of this, working together and all. But what happened was amazing. So Hillman did his talk on puer and senex, which was just profound. And Robert was amazed by it and started asking him questions. And the next thing, Robert said, well,
because I would imagine Robert Bly had a lot of puer now in the leaping,
he
and
was a puer.
yeah. So the thing is
Well, that's
that
part of the problem.
his genius was coming from some of that puer.
Completely. Read his poetry, it's poems. So, but he had never had a job. And so he's telling all these young guys that they need to get jobs. And I'm saying he never had a job. You can't listen to that. He's talking about something he hasn't experienced. And so, and then Hillman, besides being a genius of psychology, had his own printing operation. He was a publisher. He actually had jobs. He had been in the Navy too. So anyway, the great thing was, though, the big argument happens and Robert goes, oh, that's a better idea. So then all of us agreed that this puer was this very rich ground, and that if men in particular couldn't find this puer spirit, they couldn't find eros. They couldn't find enough love, because the puer is the lover at times. And if they couldn't find that puer, they could slide into the negative senex and become the grumpy old man, or become the fixated military type. And so Hillman's ideas were so much bigger, and Robert agreed to that. And then we started all, then working together. And the other thing that happened was stories, especially mythic stories and fairy tales, created a ground for both of them to come in, each with their own genius. And so I would be there as the storyteller, and then they could both bring all kinds of intuition, insight, and poetic or philosophical elements into a discussion of a story. And so
a strange alchemical combination between the three. But I just want to say one thing. I couldn't imagine Hillman banging on your drum and getting the rhythm quite right, as much as I love you. But I might be wrong. I might be wrong.
Well, here's the interesting thing. So Robert used to play a Middle Eastern lute kind of instrument, but he didn't know how to play it. He would just strum it, and then he would read poems while he strummed it. But Hillman, as far as I know, couldn't play a drum. But Hillman tap danced.
Oh, that's right, of course.
When we were doing events together, I would always tell Jim to bring his tap shoes. And then, and so after the whole, Three Amigo thing was going for years, the audience would often, some of the audience would know that Jim would tap dance. So at the end of an event, we would all say tap, 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 and Jim would get up, put on it, and he would dance. And it was really important, because part of the idea was, and it's come back now in the United States, especially, the politics has become gender opposition really strongly. This guy, Donald Trump, being the strong man. And now he's running against a Black Asian woman for president. And so everybody's now doing polarized gender stuff. But what we were doing was saying a man needs to have his soul. And a man needs to know how to dance, and he has to know some poetry, and he has to know how to sing. Because I would also bring songs, and we would
they're
all
kind
sing.
of animate. They're animate things, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah. And so that was something we wound up really agreeing on, and we had a great time. It was amazing. And for me, it was amazing because they were each of them a mentor to me in certain ways, and they were both older. When I met them, they each had published at least 15 books, and I had never written anything. And so it was this really opening the world bigger for me.
Yeah.
And they each were generous in their own way too.
Yeah.
And so that was a great period.
Man, yeah, great. Well, that's great, Michael, and it's been a pleasure speaking to you. And there's so much in there, you know, and so much to think about, and so much good stuff.
Great being with you, John. And yeah, it's been a great conversation.
Thanks very much.
All right, be well.